profesionalai visi ir turi savo nuomonę, turi savo argumentus, tai aš tikrai kviesiu būti aktyviais ir interaktyviais viso susitikimo metu. Replikuot, klausti, reaguot, diskutuot, o mūsų šį susitikimą pradės šio forumo organizatoriai, Socialinės apsaugos ir darbo ministerija ir Monika Navickienė, ministrė atsakinga už socialinę apsaugą. Ministrė, prašau. Ar tribūna jūs?
Tribūna. Sveiki, garbūs susirinkusieji, welcome. Ilgai lauktas formatas, tiesą sakant, šios konferencijos laukiau ilgą laiką, todėl kad diskusijos šią temą, turbūt ne tik Lietuvoje, vyksta gana intensyvios ir argumentai sykiais būna labai racionalūs, sykiais būna emocionalesni. Galbūt kartais tai priklauso ir nuo rinkiminių ciklų, bet aš turiu vilties, kad tai, kas šiuo metu vyksta Lietuvoje ir ta diskusija, kuri vyksta Lietuvoje, gali būti tokia gera aikštelė susitarti. Susitarti, ką darome toliau ir kokia mūsų kryptis laukia ateityje. Aš labai džiaugiuosi, kad šiandieną čia dalyvauja ir sprendimų priėmėjai, ir politikai, ir ekonomistai, ir darbdaviai, ir fondų dalyviai, profesinės sąjungos, visi žmonės, kurie vienaip ar kitaip yra susiję, nes šita tema tikrai yra labai kompleksinė, dalyvauja ir pozicija, ir opozicija, kas yra irgi labai gerai, nes tvarumas, mano įsitikinimu, sistemos tvarumas ir nuoseklumas, jisai yra vienas iš sėkmės raktų. Tai jau kurį laiką pas mus viešoji erdvė šiek tiek užkaitusi nuo diskusijų apie tai, kokią pensijų sistemą norime matyti ir apie tai, koks vaidmuo pensijų sistemoje tenka būtent pensijų kaupimui. Ir pastarojo laiko diskusija be kita ko paskatino ir aukštumas pasiekusi infliacija ir faktas, kad 22 metais tie metai nebuvo patys sėkmingiausi ir finansų rinkose. Privatus pensijų kaupimas Lietuvoje egzistuoja nuo jau beveik 20 metų. Tai pensijų fondai savo veiklą pradėjo 2004 metais. Pensijų kaupime Lietuvoje dalyvauja apie 1,4 milijono dalyvių. Šiuo metu 6 pensijų kaupimo bendrovės valdo per 6,5 milijardus eurų Lietuvos gyventojų pensijų turto. Skatindama gyventojų savo lėšomis kaupti papildomai, valstybė skiria lėšų skatinamajai įmokai. Čia irgi toks yra šiuo metu ir diskusinis dalykas, bet tai yra taip, kaip veikia pas mus Lietuvoje. Turime gana gerai veikiančią ir Lietuvos banko prižiūrimą pensijų kaupimo sistemą, tačiau jai nestinga kritikos ir dėl kai kurių specifinių aspektų. Per 20 sistemos galiojimo metų priimti įstatymo keitimai lėmė, kad nemaža dalis kaupiančiųjų tam tikrais laikotarpiais rinkosi mokėti itin mažas įmokas arba iš vis sustabdyti įmokų pervedimą. Deja, logiškas šių pasirinkimų rezultatas buvo toks, kad mažos sukauptos sumos, netitinkančios galimai turėtų didelių lūkesčių gauti dosnesnes pensijas. Nemažai įtampų visuomenėje kėlė ir tas faktas, kad ilgą laiką į pensijų kaupimą buvo pervedama ir socialinio draudimo įmokos dalis. Tai toks pensijų kaupimo finansavimo būdas jis mažino ir taip mažas socialinio draudimo pensijas. Nors vienas iš 2004 metų pensijų reformos tikslų buvo lengvinti valstybės naštą ir diversifikuoti pensijų mokėjimo šaltinius, vis dėlto būtina kalbėti ne tik apie finansinį, bet ir apie socialinį pensijų sistemos tvarumą. Finansiškai tvari sistema, bet leidžianti užtikrinti gyventojams mažas pensijas, bet leidžianti užtikrinti gyventojams tik mažas pensijas, jinai nėra tvari socialiai. 2019 metais situaciją ėmėmės taisyti ir tuomet įsigaliojo visa eilė pakeitimų, kuriais siekta, kad pensijų kaupimas būtų ne vien taupimo instrumentas, o atlieptų pensijų tikslus. Tai yra, kad sistema apimtų kuo daugiau gyventojų, o sukauptos lėšos taptų periodiškai iki gyvos galvos mokama išmoka bei papildytų socialinio draudimo pensijas. Siekiančio tikslo įstatyme atsirado automatinis įtraukimas bei ribos, kai gyventojams pensijų lėšos neišmokamos vienkartinė išmoka. Daugiau saugumo sistemai suteikė ir tai, kad vieninteliu pensijų anuitetų mokėtojų tapo valstybės institucija Sodra. Jau gana greitai dalį mums rūpimų klausimų, atsakymų, tiksliau į mums rūpimus klausimus pateiks Konstitucinis teismas, kuris turėtų išaiškinti, ar pagrindiniam šalies įstatymui neprieštarauja privalomas pensijų kaupimo tęstinumas iki pat senatvės pensijos amžiaus ir ribojimai dėl vienkartinių išmokų išmokėjimo iš pensijų fonde sukaupto turto. Mūsų 20 metų patirtis reformuojant ir perreformuojant pensijų kaupimo sistemą mus išmokė labai svarbaus dalyko – įsiklausyti į skirtingas nuomonės ir ieškoti geriausių sprendimų. Pensijų sistemos pakeitimai negali būti skuboti ir revoliuciniai, nors jau šiandien jaučiame didelį spaudimą keisti pensijų kaupimo sistemą skubiai ir radikaliai. Vis dėlto manome, kad mūsų kelias pamatuoti ir išdiskutuoti. Pamatuoti ir išdiskutuoti. Ir sprendimai, negriaunant sistemos, o padedant jai tapti stipresnė, skaidresnė, patikimesnė, atitinkančią jai keliamus tikslus, tai yra didesnės pajamas senatvėje. Lietuva nėra vienintelė valstybė, kuri sprendžia klausimą apie tai, kokios turi būti ribos tarp valstybės nustatytų taisyklių ir paties asmens laisvės apsispręsti dėl savo ateities ir būsimos pensijos. Smagu matyti tikrai čia didelį būrį žmonių, turinčių skirtingus įsitikinimus ir skirtingas nuomonės apie tai, kaip turėtumėm veikti toliau. Ir aš kažkodėl visada nepaliauju tikėti, kad toje įvairovėje mes ir galime surasti pačius geriausius sprendimus. Retorinių klausimų iškelt savo kalbos pabaigoje galėčiau nemažai, bet to nedarysiu. Norėčiau būti nustebinta išvadomis, kurias pavyks bendromis jėgomis pasiekti. Gaila, fiziškai negalėsiu dalyvauti visoje konferencijoje, bet šiuolaikinių technologijų pagalba, kaip žinote, viskas yra įmanoma, tikrai pasivysiu, nes ilgai lauktas šis formatas ir viliuosi, kad jisai duos paskatą tokiai racionalesniai, tvariai diskusijai labai svarbių mūsų visų ateities klausimų. Tai ačiū labai.
Susitarti tikrai šitoj sistemoje, nežinau, įmanoma dabar galvoju iš to, ką pats matau, noriu palinkėti nuoširdžiai jums sėkmės tariantis. Tikrai tai yra svarbu ir bent jau čia, kiek aš pažįstu tų žmonių, kurie yra ir kartais eteriuose debatuojant pensijų temą, susitarti gan sunku būna, bet tikrai linkiu kantrybės, nes kito kelio nėra. Kito kelio nėra, jeigu žinot, paprastai tai pasakysiu, jeigu nenorim, kad šiandien, žinot, ypač lietuviška mūsų auditorijos dalis, mokytojų dalis ateina streikuoti. Visas kontekstas yra toks. Aš važiuoju šiandien ir galvoju, aš nenoriu, kad po 20 metų čia ateitų žmonės ir paklausų, o ką jūs padarėte, arba ko jūs nepadarėte, kad mūsų pensija šiandien tokia maža. Tai kad tie žmonės neateitų, man atrodo, mes visi turim savęs paklausti ir šiandien mes viską padarėm, kad tie žmonės neteitų po 20 metų čia. Tai bičiulės ir bičiuliai, tęsiant mūsų, tokia tikrai ta susitarimo, galbūt ir bus čia tam tikrą aikštelę, paieškoto susitarimo ir galbūt net ir bus šita konferencija posūkio taškas po 20 metų prisiminsime, ten stovėjo ministrė, ten buvo mes ir ten kažkas tai atgimė tokio iš ko, nežinau, į vieną ar kitą pusę, iš ko mes paskui turim, sakykime, stabilesnę, tvaresnę sistemą. Bet pasiklausykim, yra šalių, kaip sakyti, dviračių neišradinėkim, Amerikų neatrastinėkim, yra šalių, kurios nuėjo kelią ir susitarimo kelią, ir klaidų kelią, ir turi dabar kažką sukūrę ir papasakos, kaip tai pavyko. Tai aš labai noriu džiaugtis ir kviesti mūsų šios konferencijos dalyvius, pirmiausiai profesorių daktarą Yves Stevens, Leuveno universiteto Belgijoje profesorių, kuris praleido daug metų socialinės saugos klausimus, svarstymuose ir sprendimuose. Professor, it's amazing you are here in Vilnius and the stage is yours.
Thank you. Just try to find the, I suppose conference here means conference. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. I would like to thank you for having me here. That was asked actually to look at possible introduction or possible way of looking at occupational pension, workforce pensions in Lithuania. And I will do so from an international perspective. I've been working in occupational pensions for 25 years. And I've been in many countries in Europe mainly, looking at how these systems function. So I will be talking about pensions, culture, reforms, lump sum, hardships, and so on. Now, this is a small overview of what I want to talk about. I would like to start with something on pension identity, actually. So when we look at pension systems, we actually consider pensions as being an element of the welfare state, and that's true. Pensions are embedded in the social, cultural, and sociological aspects of a nation. And then you all know that each, and you can fill in your own how you look at this, country, state, nation has its own cultural identity. But cultural identity also reflects the welfare state. And when you look at the welfare state, then we actually see that there are underlying pension identities in the world. Now, I'm going to give you two perspectives, actually. The first one is that when you look at pensions, it's often a socio-economically construed element, either around fight against poverty or something about income replacement ratio. You hear a lot of countries saying we're on the fight against poverty, or we're on income replacement ratio. And there even are lists, like for example, the Mercer Global Pension Index. And then they say, look, Denmark is the best country, or the Netherlands is the best country, or this country is the best country. But the starting point there is always the fight against poverty or the income replacement ratio. That's fine, it's a good perspective. But it's only a very small perspective, because it only looks at how socioeconomically pensions are embedded. I'm going to give you an example. United Kingdom, even worse after the Brexit, is very high when it comes to the sustainability of the pension system. I would not like to live in the United Kingdom when it's on adequacy. So how you look at the pension system actually also defines how the pension system evolves and is identified. And this leads actually to a more socio-political and socio-legal interpretation on how we define the pension identity of a country, because each country has its own pension identity. And I always laugh with this, because when we're around traveling, Inga, with the others in the world, we often get this question, so, Professor, what is the best pension system in the world? It's ridiculous. It does not exist. There are no good or bad systems. It is just every system has every pension system, every country has its own identity, and you have to work with that. There is no such thing as one size fits all. And this year I wrote a book on EU pension law, and it's on all these different types of rules that are actually existing on European level. And one of the main messages I can bring actually is, you can think about copying pension ideas, and you can even copy pension laws. For example, Poland, with the auto-enrollment system, they more or less copied what the United Kingdom did, and Italy did it as well. It didn't work. Why not? Because it's against part of the mentalities, the culture, or the identities. A lot of the Eastern European countries, they had a follow-up with the World Bank, reform. And then we saw in the 2010s, we had real reforms. And why is that? Because it's often a cultural or a pension identity thing. So when you look at a pension, not from a socio-economic point of view, but from a socio-political point of view, we should understand that the patient concept that lies in a system can be very different. For example, a patient can be seen as a form of a deserved rest. Why am I entitled to a pension? Because I deserve to rest. There's one country in Europe where the deserved rest is the main feature of the patient identity. It's France. In France, when you try to raise the pensionable age, everyone cries out, no way you can do that. Why? Because the deserved rest idea is really into their identity. If you would raise the pensionable age in the Netherlands, that's far less strong. Why? Because they're far more on the element of social insurance or far more on the element of citizenship. So depending where you are, you have different forms and you have different elements. For example, in Lithuania, your second pillar, paid out by Soda. It is clear when you look at that system that it's not an element of citizenship. It is not an element of deserved rest. But people think more like that when they pay a contribution, that's a part of their saving, it's a part of their property, and it's a part of how their patient identity is actually somewhere between remuneration, savings, and property. But it's nothing to do with the compensations for civil service or a reward for military services. So depending on the typology and your identity, there can be structures and there can be evolutions. So when you see this, you understand that depending on in which country you go, you have other reflections on how patient identities work. So patient identities evolve and involve certain patient concepts simultaneously, and they shift, they move. When you look, for example, I'm going to give a very strong example that will be this later coming back again. United Kingdom had very strong occupational pensions, workforce pensions. And it was obligatory, mandatory annuities. So you had to pay out monthly annuity. And then there came this minister, Steve Webb, who was a Liberal Democrat, and he said, we will allow you to pay out in lump sums, one go. And what happened? Overnight, in not 5 years, United Kingdom shifted from a country going from annuities to lump sums. And that actually changed the mentality and the identity of the United Kingdom when it comes to pensions. Why? Because there was a shift in the mentality, because the pension, occupational pension, was seen as a part of remuneration, was seen as an element of social insurance, and all of a sudden it moved towards an element of individual insurance and an element of property. That happens when you move from mandatory annuity to lump sum. So there's not a country that did that. Australia, superannuation used to be mandatory annuities. They shifted to lump sums, and all of a sudden the mentality and the identity changed. And that is very difficult. It's not good or bad. I'm not saying whether it's good or bad. It doesn't matter. It's neutral. But it changes the identity. It changes actually how you look at the pension system as a whole. So, for example, if you would like to introduce workplace pensions, there are very different systems in the world. There is not one definition of a workplace pension. For example, when you take the United States of America, the main systems that are now in place in the United States, it is not DB, it is not ERISA 401k, it's not ERISA 403b. That are the three used to be main pension systems in the United States of America. Nowadays, when you go to the States, it's all IRA, individual retirement accounts. It's pure saving accounts. And it's the individual who pays, and it's the individual who who pays and who saves actually for his pension money. Hence, the average American considers his occupational pension as being a property right, a real property right. It's nothing to do with insurance, but it's a real property right. Hence, when an American has troubles, for example, illness, or becomes unemployed, or has children that needs to go to college, all these things cost a lot of money. What does he say? It's my money, and I want it now. So they can take it out and they can take it early withdrawal, hardship clauses. So that actually means that in the United States, we really shifted from social insurance to property in 20 years' time. So several systems in place with several possibilities. And when we look at workplace pensions, I think it's, when you would ask me, because that's the title actually of the presentation, I think, what is the main feature between personal pensions and state guaranteed pensions? I think the main issue there, and it's something Paul Roos will talk about later on, is actually that you force employers and employees to work together. And it's something that Bismarck, actually, the guy on the right, Otto von Bismarck in the 19th century, developed. You all know Bismarck. Why did he install actually the social insurance type of thing? Why did he want to have the trade unions and the employers together? Any idea? You ever read the history on Otto von Bismarck? The main reason was actually that he was afraid. He was bloody scared. Why? Because at that time, there was a book going around in Germany, written by a guy called Marx, 30 years earlier, together with Engels, and he was really afraid of a revolution. And he said, look, we need the employees and the employers to work together. If you can't beat them, join them and then beat them. That's the main reason actually why Otto von Bismarck was installing social insurance elements. And that's the strength actually of occupational pensions, because you oblige, in a way, to have the employers and the employees to sit together and work out the system. And it can be very individual. It can be on a collective basis, a collective agreement basis, or it can be on a tripartite. But when you say you have to work together, then they will have to work together, and then you have to come to a common conclusion. Have you ever been married? Have you ever had a partnership? Then you know you need compromises. If not, there is something wrong in your marriage, I think. So, but if you're married, you know that you need to have compromises. And that's actually what Otto von Bismarck had in mind. And that's what we see in workplace pensions. Let's take an example. The Netherlands is one of the major countries in workplace pensions. They have over 600 billion euros in assets, which is huge. How come does it work? Because employers and employees are on the same level at the same table to decide on how these structures work. And I think workplace pensions are strong because of this, actually. But Paul will elaborate probably far more on this. But that's, in my opinion, the main feature. Now, pension reforms. You can write entire books about pension reforms, but first thing is perhaps, that's actually the last point I want to make here. Have you ever built a house? I don't know how it's in Lithuania, but when you build a house in Belgium, there are two constraints. One, it's far more costly than the architect told you. And secondly, it takes far more time than anyone told you. Is it the same in Lithuania? It's the same with pension reforms. It always costs far more and it takes far longer. But that's in any pension reform happening around the world. Now, when you look at people explaining pension reforms, it's often very technical. We change this and we change that. The technicalities are actually about technicalities. There are narratives behind it. There is a political and ideological narrative behind it. And then you need to be able to understand why someone is explaining something from what perspective, from what kind of pension concept that lies behind it. Because if you were talking to a liberal or a Democrat or a socialist or a communist, and you understand why his or her reasoning is in what concept, then you're far easier to understand the narrative they are proposing. It's important to understand the reasons or motives driving these narratives. Now, any pension reforms is about processes and not about revolutions. Now, another thing is, that's something I found out, well, already a long time ago, but that we see far more and more, is that pension policies are actually not used as pension policies, but as labor market policies. And that's something we should realize. For example, if people say we want to raise the pensionable age, then it can be in order to have a sustainable pension system, but it can also mean that you want to have a change in the labor market policy. And we see, for example, that labor market policies often influence the pension policy, because pension policies are not always the same as labor market policies. I don't know how it's in Lithuania, but in a lot of countries, you see, for example, that militaries, people that are military, they can retire earlier than other categories. Is it the same in Lithuania? Let's think about that. If you say that you're in the military, fine, you can retire earlier. And what do these people do? What do they do afterwards? They go working in the private sector, in the black, gray economy, or the white economy, or any economy, whatever. But then you should ask yourself, is this a problem of the pension policy, or is this a problem of the labor market policy? And that's often the thing that we start changing the pension policy to solve the labor market policy. And that's something this is the same with what's called hardship. In a lot of countries, people can retire earlier because they have a tough job, like a fireman, policeman, and so on. But then the question arises, why do we do this? If we say he or she has a tough job, why don't we give him or her a higher wage at that moment instead of allowing him or her to retire earlier? I'm not saying one way or the other, but I'm really saying that we see a strong influence of labor market policies in pension policies. Now, the standards are trust and confidence in any pension system. So you always need to go gradual when you reform. You need to create transition periods. You need to try to respect the legitimate expectations of people. That's something that France missed completely. They did it far too strong. So what you do is actually you make cohorts, and then you make not life cycle cohorts, but you make cohorts whereby you can postpone actually some of the transitions, and you create specific rules. Other things, don't over communicate your reform. I know politicians, look at me, I'm reforming, but you can overdo it. And there is one country that is now actually really overdoing it. You have people, you should read Dutch newspapers because they have a new pension reform, and the government is really scared of its own reform. They have a website called "Why You Should Not Be Afraid of the Pension Reform." You know, people are not that stupid. So I should be afraid of the pension reform probably, because a lot of people actually are afraid. And another website is called Pension Certainty, but it actually creates exactly the opposite of what they want to do, because now people are all of a sudden, should I be uncertain about my pension system? So the Dutch are really a clear example of two websites that are over communicating their reform. So don't do that. There's a very interesting paper written by Lisa Brugge on over pension communication, and with Netspa, it's on their website. I can give it to you. So never preach revolution, but teach evolution there. Another thing for pension policy reformers. I'm still on time. Yeah. Pension reformers should politically understand actually that people, citizens in general, they do not look at the pension system as being a system. They only see, what do I get out of it? What's my outcome? And so they consider a pension system as being a kind of set of rules and regulations. So they change this and they change that. But of course, we all know that pension systems are systems and not just rules and regulations. And that's something, yeah, we often forget when we look at pension reforms. Now, before I go into these two elements, I want to say something else on good pension systems and occupational pension systems. That I forgot to say just a few minutes ago. So you know that you can look at pension systems from a perspective of sociology and economy. And then you can say what country has a high or a low income replacement ratio. And then European Commission usually uses two standards. It's adequacy and sustainability. And Steven can explain this far better than I do, how these two are measured. But I want to give you an example of if you focus too much on sustainability and adequacy, you might miss other elements. The Belgian will be the president of the European Council from January on, and we're heading this working group on gender pension policy gaps. And you know what? Where is one of the biggest gender gaps in Europe when it comes to pensions? It's in the Netherlands. The Netherlands have a true problem with women and pensions. Sustainability is high, adequacy is high, but not for women. Why is that? Because childcare is very, very expensive in the Netherlands. So women are more or less obliged to stay at home. Workforce pensions are very important. So if they stay home, they don't have a workforce pension. And hence, what do we see? That the adequacy of pensions for women in the Netherlands is one of the lowest in Europe. And that's quite an amazing thing to state. And now, of course, we see that other countries have other issues with women and with transgender and with LGBTQI+. And we see actually that the Netherlands is really lagging behind. So it's something I just wanted to say when you look at pension system as a whole. Now, I was asked to reflect on two elements of pension reforms in general. One is actually on lump sums, and one is on early withdrawal and hardship clause. So lump sums is actually you pay out in one go, as you know, and hardship clauses and early withdrawal is actually is that you can take out the money earlier than when you retire, and hardship is actually that you're allowed to take some of the money out because you're in hardship. Okay. First, look at Lithuania. This is always a tricky part. When you're in a country and you talk about the country itself, you're often wrong somewhere. So you can hit me after lunch. So if I understood it correctly, the payout phase, so the first pillar, statutory based pension, is a lifelong indexed monthly annuity. So far, so good? Okay. Now, when you look at the non-state pensions, I don't know how to call it really, the system. It's not a real second pillar type of World Bank, but it's not third pillar either. It's something in between type of thing. Now, as the minister said, that it's a SODRA, of course, centralized provider of annuity services since 2020. And then I started reading Lithuanian law. Long live people. And the more I read about Lithuanian law and how this system works, I found out that you have 3.5, you have 4 ceilings. So you have a free haven, like New Zealand and Australia, and it's around 5,400 euros. If your accumulated wealth is lower than 5,400, you can get a lump sum. Still okay. Now, when you look at the free haven, then we have to agree on something. That is, it is normal. Quasi every country in the world has this kind of free haven, and we can discuss about the height, but it's normal. Why is it normal? Because the cost, the administrative cost and the cost of organizing an annuity for very small amounts is just not worth money. So that's normal. And then I have to say, Lithuania, you have a very ingenious, sophisticated, granular system with above a ceiling, 64,000 euros or something like that. Then you have a choice of a lump sum, but you can also take an annuity. And then in between, you have either a standard or a deferred annuity. And you can have a deferred purchase money plan where we just the return on investment. And so, if I would be cynical, I would say the Lithuanians didn't know what to choose. So they chose everything. Because it's a little bit everything. But when I'm not cynical, I would say, actually, it's not a bad model. It is not a bad model because it allows one thing that is often wanted by people when looking at workforce pensions, and that is flexibility. In your annuity lump sum schemes from Lithuania, you allow a lot of flexibility with the free haven and lump sum. And then above the ceiling, the mandatory annuity purchase for the 60 or the whole amount of lump sum. And then you have the annuity purchase, as I just explained. So in your system, you have this flexibility. But then I got the real, that moment, because the reason, but at that moment, I got the real figures of amounts that are circulating in the Lithuania. And then I have to admit, you are having like a spaceship, built an entire spaceship, but you don't have the fuel to run it. Because the average amount that I got from the figures is so low that quasi everyone is in the free haven. Because the average amount is around 6,000 euros. So when the minister here tells, just here in the introduction, that the amounts paid, the contributions paid in the systems are low, if the translation was correct, at least, and that they were even declining over the years, if the translation was correct. Is that correct? That's what I heard, at least in the translation. Now, then I can only say one thing. It's a very simple, basic law in any pension system, sir. The less money you put into it, the less money we'll get out of it. And it has nothing to do with funded or pay as you go, collective defined contribution or defined benefit. If you don't put money in it, there will not come money out of it. A pension system is not a money maker. It's not like winning the lotto. So first things to be said is actually, when you look at the Netherlands, do you have any idea what is the average contribution rate in 2022 in the Dutch workforce pension? Any idea, sir? How much money, what contribution rate you have? Any idea? 10%. It was 31% of average salary last year. No wonder there's a lot of money going on in that system. So any pension system, whether it's pay as you go or funded workforce or any other, it requires, the spaceship requires fuel. And there you see that there is a big difference between countries. Now, let's look at some countries with annuities and lump sums. The colors do have meaning. So when you look actually at Australia, Belgium, Canada, South Africa, Sweden, United Kingdom, and United States, they're really into lump sums. Like Belgium, we do allow annuities, but they're very uncommon, they're very rare, because everyone takes a lump sum. When we look at Australia, superannuation used to be mandatory annuity, then they changed it to voluntary annuity, and nowadays everyone buys a lump sum. When I was in Australia, you still were obliged to pay a part of your annuity in, you still were money purchase plans, and you still were obliged to buy some part of an annuity. And then the market actually really collapsed in a way, because you could go to any provider, and then one provider said, yeah, if you buy it here, you get a microwave oven. And if you buy it here, you get an electric bike. So this market was really disrupted at that time. Nowadays, we see that in Australia, everything is more or less lump sum. Very, very few. Now, you see that Germany and Poland, and I must be very careful here because my Polish colleagues are here, but they're actually in between their lump sums. And now, there is one country actually that's very strange. It is very strange in many ways because I've been there many times, and I have to admit it's one of the strangest countries in the world. All I'm talking about, Japan. This is something that's really strange because Japan, annuities are standard, but lump sum payments are possible. And what do we see? And that's purely cultural. The Japanese people, they buy annuities while they can't have lump sums. And that's the only country that I know that goes directly against the flow of all other countries. And Paul, you can correct me if you, but this is something cultural in the Japanese society. Because normally people want to have the lump sum and they will not buy the annuity. Big discussion in the Netherlands. The Netherlands have mandatory lifelong annuities. In the 80s and the 90s, a lot of these annuities were indexed. After the financial crisis 2009-2010, a lot of the Dutch pension funds were really in difficult water. And they could not index their pensions anymore. Did you know that? This was really problematic. The Dutch, they could not afford to index their annuities. And what do we see now with the new pension reform? Big debate. There is talks going on to allow a 10% take-up of assets in lump sum forms. It's actually in the law, but it's not yet in place. And the minister has already said, well, we have to be careful. Why? Why? Now I'm going to do something stupid again. Because they're actually really afraid of this. Because the Netherlands, their workforce pension is really an element of social insurance. They really consider their lifelong annuities as being a part of their pension identity. But if you allow, like for example, in the United Kingdom, if you allow first to have 10%, then someone will say, why is it only 10%? It's my money. I want 20%. And then it shifts to 30%. And that's now really going on in the Netherlands because they are afraid that if they change, again, people don't consider pension systems as being set systems. They consider it to be a set of rules. But of course, if you change from lump sum, from annuity to lump sum, then it shifts the system entirely. Why is that? Because in the pension system itself, it's calculated how long the longevity rate will be in the pension fund. what discount rate do you have to take when you pay out annuities? Discount rate is very important in occupational pensions because the discount rate means how much money you would need to set aside for later, how to pay out the annuity. But if you pay out in lump sums, nobody cares because the longevity risk and the investment risk only lies with the individual. Because it's only the individual who has to decide how to invest, and it's only the individual who has his own life and his own longevity. So if you see the Netherlands having a shift from element of social insurance to a sort of property, we really understand that a lot of the Dutch people are really anxious about having this shift from mandatory lifetime annuities to the lump sums. By the way, there are people here from pension funds. I'm going to give you an insight. One of the elements, of course, is rather cynical in the Dutch discussion. Because if you have annuities, then in your mortality and in your discount, you need to take into account what the future will be, of course. But when you pay out the lump sums, there's nothing going on. And hence, when you can take out 10% on lump sums, you can start calculating how much your solvency ratio on the Solvency II and your goes down, of course. So there is something cynical in this discussion as well in the Netherlands. Now, South Africa, Sweden, all lump sums. United Kingdom, very rapid shift to lump sums. With a tax-free lump sum, usually up to 25% in less than a decade. So Steve Webb was minister when 2012, 2013, I think. Really rapid shift. And the United States, so it's lump sum, IRA, it's lump sum, and then under Obama, you had the ERISA 401k plans and ERISA 403b plans, but they were allowed to shift over to IRAs, and now in the States, everyone has more or less lump sum. Unless you're with a public state fund, whereby the public state fund says, like for example, Oklahoma, Iowa, there the public state fund says, no, it needs to be a lifelong, non-indexed annuity. My conclusion is here that in occupational or workforce pensions, mandatory lifelong annuities are not common worldwide. It's not common standard to have. You now understand why I said when I looked at Lithuania that you had a very granular, sophisticated system like with the force. You can't get that on one slide actually. Now, that's what I told you about. You have a lot of small plots and a lot of dormant rights with the 6,000 euros. I think that would be my main message actually towards Lithuania, that if you want to have a look at workforce pensions, then employers and employees need to sit together. I think that's obvious, otherwise it would not be a workforce pension. Then you need to look at tax subsidies. How much do you want to tax it? Most workforce pensions, they start by the rule of three. You know that? The rule of three. Most workforce, so historically, it's €1 from the employer, €1 from the employee, and €1 from the state. That's how it usually started when we go back 100 years ago. And not then, of course, it waters down, and it's how, but usually it starts like that. But if you don't put money in it, then you'll have very small accumulated wealth. Okay. So I already talked about this. Lump sums, you shift the risk, longevity, and investment to the individual. And then again, from the perspective of the individual. Here, the idea about lump sums and annuities is actually, look, if I have an annuity and I die, what will happen? So then you see actually that a lot of transfers are going on. Another thing is, of course, the want and need for individual flexibility. We believe, as persons, individual freedom. And then, what does this require when we look at patients? We believe that we want to have flexibility with the lump sums. But then we should start looking at what do people spend their lump sums on? And it's a black hole, so we really don't know what people are doing with it. There are some studies, It's very difficult to say. One of the ideas is always the same. If you give people a lump sum, 200,000 euros, they will buy a Ferrari with it. Is it true or not? We actually don't know. Tonight, when you're at home or elsewhere, I don't know where you are tonight. Tonight, this afternoon, when you're not working or doing something else, you should look at a small fragment on YouTube whereby Steve Webb is actually the Minister of Patience in Great Britain. He's actually saying, we will allow lump sums. And the journalist asked, but aren't you afraid that people will buy cars with it? And exactly at that moment, a Maserati drives by. And like, look. And Steve's answer is, I knew Steve from before because he used to be a social scientist actually in Scotland. He was a great researcher actually. He's not a Tory, he's not from Labour, he's a liberal Democrat. And he actually says, well, I don't care, it's his own responsibility. And that's actually what I mean by patient identity. It's how you look at the patient and how you define the patient. But what we know actually from studies already long time ago, do you know what happens with lump sums in most countries? When you give people lump sums? No. People don't dare to spend it because people think, okay, this is for later. But they don't realize that for them, later is now. So what you actually see in large lump sums, that is actually going from inheritance to inheritance. It's actually money given to children or grandchildren. So the lump sum idea is really linked to the property idea in the patient concept for a lot of people. Now, I have to admit that I'm now stating actually a study of Jos Bergman of 2011. So it's 12 years old. I think we should redo it, but there's very few knowledge on this. Of course, there's a short-term budgetary impact on households, we know that. There's a long-term impact on means-tested the benefit is largely unknown because that's something else we hear a lot. People will spend the money. People will spend the money. And then afterwards, they will need social assistance and because they spend all their money, but we don't have data on that. Perhaps in Poland, we have data on means-tested benefits because of spending of lump sums. It's often linked to taxation. How do you want to tax it? If you tax it heavily, apart from Japan, normally people will prefer a lump sum with a high tax on an annuity with a low tax, apart from Japan. But people are in favor, more or less, of lump sums. And it tells a lot about the patient identity, as I already quoted. Okay. 6 minutes for early withdrawals. 20 slides. This will not work. Okay. Do you allow early withdrawal and hardship clauses, yes or no? Or not yet. Not yet. No. It was a rhetorical question. I know you do not allow it yet. Sorry for that. But are you in favor? No? Who's in favor? Who's not in favor? Okay, again, this is not working. Who's in favor of early withdrawal? No one. Who's not in favor of early withdrawal? Okay, we voted against. So, Minister, I don't think you've got it's not up to me to organize, but anyhow, when you look at the literature on early withdrawal and hardship clauses, it's a two-edged sword. Because in favor of allowing it, then the mainstream idea is actually that it can encourage people to take on occupational pensions and to start saving. It's called nudging theory, the nudging theory. So if you give the people the idea, look, you should save for later, you should have a pension, but if you're really in tough times, you can take it out again. So it's an incentive, an encouragement towards patients. That's the mainstream idea that's in favor. Since you're all against, I should not tell you why most people are against, because it is often that it cannot be used for other reasons than retirement. And that's true. If we believe pensions to be pensions, then we should not allow early withdrawal. And that's the main reason when we look, I'll show you the slides later on. When we look at most countries in the world, hardship clauses are very restricted. Because if you allow it, actually, people will not consider their retirement money as being retirement money. Look at the States. In the States, what is the biggest hardship reason in the States? Sir, any idea? So what is the main reason why people take out their pension money? Any idea, sir? Students' loans for their children. Their children needs to pay college money. It's very expensive. Have you ever been to an American college? Don't go there. It's far too expensive. Come to Belgium. There's a kind but it's very expensive in the States. Hence, a lot of people use their pension money to pay the college money of their children. Is that a good system? It's not up to me whether it's a good or bad system, but at least it changes how you look at your retirement money. Because then you are using the retirement money, not for retirement, but you're using it as a college money maker. And so that is why it's often limited. Now, so the situation, when you look, so I looked at the reasons why we allow hardship clauses. So we found three main reasons. So the second reason should actually be the first, is no hardship. So you're free to take it out just like that, like it's Malaysia, Singapore, it's like a savings account then. And then you have hardship, exceptional circumstances when substantial income losses occur, like unemployment or large losses of income or terminal illness. And there is a special clause, and that has to do with housing. And there we see that Switzerland, for example, allows you to use your retirement money as for a pledge, as a guarantee for your mortgage. And that's, of course, something that's a tricky one. Why? Because if you allow people to use their retirement money on housing with a pledge or a guarantee, then at least you make sure that when they retire, they have a home, a house, and hence from a public deficit point of view, you're actually doing a core spending whereby at least you don't have to subsidize home ownership at retirement, because then people have their own house. So that's a difficult one. When we look at the types of plans, in mandatory defined benefit, defined contribution, or collective defined contribution, so the three main elements, is very rare, and in the voluntary DC we see a lot of excess. So here you see actually the main, 1 minute ago, you see the main types of access, and here you have some country profiles. You have Belgium, Malaysia, Singapore, Denmark, Switzerland, Australia, Mexico. Who doesn't want to go there? New Zealand, and the States. Okay, 30 seconds to go. So you can read all these country profiles on how they work in hardship. It's all on the slide. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to give my last 30 seconds by saying actually that when you look at Lithuania from a pension reform perspective, you really see that you're in a tipping point position, I think. You're in a tipping point position because if poverty rates amongst the elderly increase, then you either have the option not to do anything, or you have the option to do something, and you really feel it that it's when you would like to start with occupational pensions. I think now is really a good time and moment, also given your demographic, with all the immigration you had in the last years. I think it's a good way of having actually kind of new labor market structure installed using occupational pensions. That was my main message. So thank you very much, and I think you all have a great future ahead. I'm sorry that I thank you very much. Thank you so much for your great.
We will have questions, answers later on in case maybe someone has, let's review, let's klausimų, trumpų klausimų. Ačiū ministrei, noriu padėkoti ministrei Ratajczak-Leszczynskiej ir lietuviškai, angliškai, Lithuanian and English usant task, but next question. After paskui mes turėsim šitą diskusiją. You said that no best system, but which one you love more? Malaysia to the United States.
The system I like most that I visited, I think it was Mongolia because I was with my friends there. The system I liked most for installing and being inventive was Nigeria. Because in Nigeria, we could really develop a brand new system using micro credentials and micro credits for installing. I do not like the way we had to install the Nigerian pension system because we work with AT&T, the American telecom provider is the main pension fund there, because in Nigeria, when you pay, each time you pay with your mobile phone, you get a micro credential on your AT&T account, and that actually is a notional defined contribution. So these are interesting systems. I think each country has its own mechanisms. I know where I don't want to retire, but otherwise, yeah, I would not like to retire in Greece, to be honest. It's a lovely country. Actually, because there is what we call a Musgrave disequilibrium. It's the Musgrave disequilibrium actually means that the average pension is higher than the average wage, the average salary, and that actually leads to a system whereby young people, they keep on studying, they keep living at home. Why? Because the pension money allows them to do so. So it's actually a Musgrave disequilibrium. Spain had a large Musgrave disequilibrium as well, because young people were dependent on the pension of the elderly. And Musgrave disequilibriums are really dangerous for societies because they alter the way societies look. I spoke too long again, sorry.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. To Poznanės. So, Joanna Ratajczak-Leszczynska. It's okay? It's okay. Poznanės University Business and Economy School. Professor, floor is yours, and 45 minutes also yours.
Yeah, thank you. Ooh. I will look for my presentation. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. It's my pleasure to present to you some messages about the occupational pensions in Poland. So I will focus solely on our experience, and I will start with talking a little bit about the pension system in Poland, and it will be an introduction to explore the reasons for development of occupational pensions, and then I will compare two forms of occupational pensions in Poland and focus a little bit on the coverage, and then of course with some conclusions. When we look at the Polish pension system, I have to underline there was no occupational pensions and individual pensions before 1989, so before the political and economic transformation. We had a DB pension formula, highly redistributive, with a very high or relatively high replacement rate of about 60–70%. And there were two reasons for not having occupational and individual pensions. First, the state was the only employer. And the second reason, we have no free or private market for occupational or individual providers. And then, 10 years after transformation, we performed a systemic pension reform, and we introduced DC pension system, which was split into two parts, the pay-as-you-go one and the funded one. And at the same time, we introduced the first form of occupational pension, which is called employee pension plans. However, so the employer were invited to take part and to take the responsibility for the future pension of their employees. However, this invitation was rather not so intrusive, let's say, and it was done for two reasons too. So the first one was the government did believe that the funding, the obligatory pension funds will compensate in the future the reduction resulting from the introduction of the DC pension formula. And secondly, the employment market at those times was very weak. I mean, we had very high unemployment rate. So the occupational pension was not treated as a tool to motivate the employees. And indeed, those plans developed very, very slowly. So the government decided to introduce two forms of individual pensions in 2004 and 2012. What I would like to do now is to focus on the obligatory pension funds and to tell you a little bit about reforms in this segment, because it is quite crucial for the future development of occupational pension plans. So they were introduced, as I mentioned, in 1999, and there were lots of reforms then done. However, I would like to mention only some of them. In 2011, the contribution to obligatory pension funds was reduced by 5 percentage points, so from 7.3 to 2.3. And then 3 years later, so-called big reform of office was done. And I would like to focus on two things. The first, offer became voluntary. They were at those time presented as the most costly part of the pension system and as the most mistaken part of the pension reform. So the government let people not to contribute. There was the default option was not to join the open pension funds again. And the second reform was remission of TVs and state bonds. As you can imagine, if all the open pension funds were obligatory, the investment policy was really restricted. So the open pension funds were allowed to invest some share of assets and some investment instruments. However, there were no limits concerning TVs and state bonds. So over 50% of assets, and exactly on the 14th February 2014, 51.5% of assets were put into those financial instruments. And the state remitted those assets. That means that the public debt was reduced by more than 7% of GDP. and the capital was converted into non-financial one, and this pension capital was recorded on the individual pension accounts in the pay-as-you-go pension pillar. Those two changes ruined trust in the state and in the financial market. So people feel cheated. They were furious. They feel the state steal the money from them, from their individual accounts. They didn't understand what really happened. 1 year later, the right-wing parties won the elections, and the new government prepared a new strategy for Poland. It was called the Plan of Responsible Development of Poland, and it was built on 5 pillars. And one of the pillars was called Capital for Development, and the very important factor for it should be increase in private savings. And as both the occupational and individual pensions were underdeveloped, you can see, so there were less than 200 PPE programs established, and it covered less than 500,000 people with very relatively low assets. So the government looked at the Great Britain and says, okay, their experience are excellent, let's use it. Also for the increase in the domestic savings, and they developed and introduced the employee capital plans. And they were implemented in 4 steps. So firstly, the employers with the biggest employers were obliged to introduce those plans, and then at the end, the smaller employers and the private sector. And what I would like to do is to compare those 2 forms of occupational pension plans and to provide you with more details. So, the PPE, so the oldest form, is not obligatory, both for the employer and the employee. And there is a big difference concerning the PPK because they are obligatory. Obligatory for the employer and quasi-obligatory for the employee. What does it mean? That the employer is obliged to establish the program, however, the employee is not obliged to join the program. But there is an auto-enrollment. That means everybody below the 55 is included in the program, and he or she can do the declaration not to contribute. So they are allowed to opt out anytime. However, every 4 years they are again and again covered by this kind of program. Those who are over 55 can join the program voluntarily. The coverage is a little bit different. So in the old PPE programs, only those employees were covered who has a labor contract, and also the employer could join the program. And in the EPK are those covered who are obligatory covered by the social insurance, the pension social insurance, and those settings. The providers are quite similar. The one exception is the PPE. The employer can establish an employee pension fund, and in the case of PPK, the running and operating and managing of the program is totally outsourced. The employee representation is quite crucial in case of PPE. So there is a requirement to sign an agreement between the employer and the employee representation about the the form of the program about the provider. And in case of PPK, it is good to have it, but it is not an obligation. If there is not possible to come to the compromise, then the employer can decide on his own. It is also possible in case of PPA to terminate the program. There are some situations in which it is allowed, and it is not the case concerning PPK. There is one little exception, and it is especially true for the small employers. So in case every employee claim he or she don't want to contribute to the program, so resign from the PPK, the employer is not obliged to set the program. And many small employers use this opportunity. It is registered and supervised by the Polish Financial Supervision Authority. In case of PPK, there is no registration. However, the provider should be listed on a special list, which is run by the PPK portal, which is then managed indirectly by state. And the supervision is then done by more than, it's not only the Polish Financial Supervision Authority, but also, for example, the State Labor Inspection. When we look at the contributions, then the contributions in the old PPE program were voluntary, as I mentioned before, and the employer can set the contribution at the level up to 7% of the salary or as a lump sum, according to the agreement with the employees' representations. And the employee can add something up to a given level. In the case of PPK, we have those three contribution players, as it's already mentioned. So we have both employer, employee, and state. And the obligatory contribution for employers at the level 1.5%, for employee at the level of 2%. However, there is a possibility to reduce this rate in case of low earners. And the state contributes paying lump sum subsidies. It is a yearly subsidy. So for those who contributed for at least 3 months during the previous year, and as a welcome payment, it is flat rate, and they haven't been valorized so far. And both employer and employee can pay additional contributions, so the total maximal contribution will amount 8%. There are no special regulations concerning PPE. However, there is an age-based model introduced in case of PPK. It means the older the participant is, the less risky the investment policy is. So it is done automatically. However, I, as a participant, can resign from it. So I can choose the sub-fund voluntarily. The costs are quite similar, so they are limited up to 0.6% of assets. There are only management costs. And there is a possibility to withdraw some pension money. There are two options. The first one is I can have access to 25% of my pension capital in case of serious illness, and it is not taxed. What does it mean, serious illness? It is listed. I don't remember everything. It's like Alzheimer or Parkinson and so on. I didn't understand it even in Polish. So, however, it is listed, and it could be also done and withdrawn in case of my illness, in case of illness of my spouse, of my husband, and in case of illness of my child. So it is 25% per person. And the second possibility is I can borrow my money from myself to cover the own contribution required by the loan for the purchase of apartment, lands, of land and so on. And however, I'm obliged to pay it off. And I have to start to pay it off during the 5 years, and should pay totally off during the 15 years. So I have, it is restricted. There are some possibilities to transfer the pension capital, and I can resign from the program anytime. So I can have access to my pension capital, however, it is reduced. In any case, it is reduced by 30% of the total sum of contributions paid by the employer. This money is then transferred into my individual account in the pay-as-you-go pension system. And it is, of course, reduced by the capital gains tax. And in case of PPK, also, it is reduced by the state subsidies. So I can withdraw, have access to this money, and then in 2 years decide to join the program again and to start to save my money for the pension again and again. We can have access to those money without any deductions since 60. There is another limit concerning age in case of PPA. There is no limit concerning PPK. And there are many forms of payouts in case of PPK. So firstly, and it is not the default option, but it is the first option, I can have access immediately to 25% of my pension capital, and I don't pay any tax. And the remaining 75% should be divided into at least 120 installments. I mean, I will get periodical payments during the next 10 years. I can also decide to take 100% of money once. However, then I have to pay tax. So taxes is a profit gain tax. If my husband and me have an account in the same provider, we can decide to have a spousal payment, and it is also calculated for the next 10 years. And of course, if I or my husband dies, then the amount of payment is not reduced, or the sum can be transferred to the family deposit or insurance company. However, those requirements I mentioned before should be also fulfilled. The tax regime is very similar. What is important, the contributions which are made by the employer are exempted from the social contribution base. It is important, I will come back to this issue later. In case of divorce, regarding PPK, part of the pension capital is then transferred to the former spouse, and in the case of death, 50% of those capital is inherited immediately, automatically by the spouse, and the rest according to the wish of the deceased. So, to sum it up, when we look at those two forms of occupational pensions in Poland, then we can see that the program which was established in 2019 is obligatory for employer, quasi-obligatory for employee. There are investments, strong investment regulations, there are hardship clauses, 4 forms of payout, and the rule of employee representation is an advisory one, And there are huge differences between those two forms. And the latest data, which I can show you, says the picture is rather positive. So when we look at the coverage, there are almost 3 million people covered by the new occupational plan. And in comparison with the PPE, which are voluntary, there is a huge difference. However, the assets are still relatively low. Also, when we look at the average pension capital or the average in relation to the average wage, or just purely expressed in Europe. However, when we have a closer look at the PPK, which are called the success in Poland, more or less, then we can see that the participation rate is at the level of about 45%. It was assumed, so the government claimed it will be at the level of 75. It is a huge difference. And as we can see, the participation is the highest in case of the biggest employer and the lowest in case of public sector. But this participation rate is overestimated. Why? For two reasons. Firstly, in the denominator of the participation rate, those employees are also added which have PPE instead of PPK. And secondly, in the denominator are not those employers counted which who didn't establish the PPK, although they were obliged to do so. So the expert says the real participation rate is at the level of about 30%. Then the average costs are relatively low. However, there are only management costs. So once again, when we add all costs, it's at the level of 1%. And the profit rate, which is published or which is then sent as a message to the public, is calculated as the most possible positive way. So it is calculated from the employee perspective. So those contributions which are paid by the employer and state, I treat it as a profit. When we do it differently, so we really compare the change in the amount of the calculation unit as it's done, then it should be done, as it should be done, then those data are also published, but we have to look for them. And the ratio is between, in the last year was between 3% and 16%, depending on the sub-funds. Okay, I tried to list some factors which are crucial for white coverage. And when we look at them, we can say, okay, most of them are really moving in case of Poland. So what is the problem? First of all, we didn't have any political consensus concerning introduction of the PPK. We had it in case of PPE, but not in case of PPK. Furthermore, people, as I mentioned before, don't trust in state and in financial market. It is the result of the open pension funds reform. And the latest data concerning trust in pension products says, say, 40% of people believe in pay-as-you-go pension. 22% believe in open pension fund. and only 18% believe in PPK. And over 40%, it is 43, I think, percent, don't know anything about PPK and don't want to know it, don't want to join, don't want to have anything come up with it. So it is a huge problem. And it is also connected with the lack of pension education. So to sum it up, a well-designed financial product is not enough to achieve a success, whatever we mean telling success. There are other important factors, and first of all, it is trust. So the employee have to trust in state, have to trust in financial product, and they don't. So for that reason, the government consider to change the constitution and to say the PPK contribution and the PPK pension capital is a private property. It is written in law, but it is not in constitution. And they hope it will increase trust in that kind of pension savings. Those who know a little bit more about PPK also don't trust in this product for one reason, and there is one important reason for it. In the equity part of investment, there is an obligation to invest at least 40% of assets in the Big 20 index. The Big 20 index includes 20 biggest companies listed on the stock exchange. And the state managed over 50% of those companies. So people don't want to give their private money to be managed by the state and to be invested in whatever, but by the state and not by the private market. When we look at the employers, they are not really ready to take any responsibility for the future pension of their employees. They perceived the PPK as an obligation, as cost, and they would like to avoid those costs, of course. Let's have a broader look. So it is assumed, because the contributions into the PPK are exempted from the contribution base of social insurance, it is assumed that the PPK pension will, to some extent, subsidize the social insurance pension. So people do believe they will receive a lifelong annuity, and it is in case of social insurance. On the other hand, they want to have access to their pension because pension capital, because they treat it as a private property, what already Stephen said before. So, but they would not. So the default option is you will receive your pension during the first 10 years after retirement. You can, of course, claim a lifelong annuity, but I do not believe anybody will do it for two reasons. The pensions will be too low, and secondly, we have no annuity market in Poland. It is a very expensive product. So at the end, we have to ask very important question about the compromise between paternalism, between the responsibility of the state and between the freedom of the employee and employer. And every state should answer this important question. Because as you can see in Poland, we have huge inconsistency according to this question. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you so much, and let me invite you and Professor Yves on the stage. Maybe I will take 2 chairs to sit for you and to answer public questions. Maybe we will organize in Lithuanian questions, more comfortable for audience, and chair. It's okay. Okay. Klausimai, atsakymai, and use headphones if you can. Klausimai, atsakymai, we have here a broad spectrum of politicians, even shadow Social Democrats minister, galbūt ateities ministrą turim čia, bet kaip jūs sekate, kokius galvojat klausimus, aš 2 profesoriams tiesiog noriu užduoti štai tokį klausimą. Aš mėgstu viešas vietas, važiuoti troleibusu, eiti viešą stadioną, pirtį kažkur, kad girdėčiau, apie ką kalba žmonės. Ir sykį pirtyje 3 vyrai kalbėjo visai neseniai. Ar tu žinai, kad Lietuvoje yra diktatūra? Sakau, kodėl? Mano sukauptos pensijos man neleidžia pasimti. Mano pinigų man neleidžia niekas pasimti. Aš sakau, bet iš sodros nelabai galima. Bet ne, čia yra mano pinigai. Ką jūs būtumėt atsakę šitiem 3 žmonėm, kurie taip prie poilsio pirtyje kalbės? Profesoriau, nuo jūs ir Joanna paskui.
First, I would say that they should turn down the heat a little bit. Secondly, I think I would say that I would not be surprised. Because when we look at the Lithuanian setup, there are many elements of flexibility, and that actually leads more and more to the idea that people believe their pension to be kind of property, right? It also has to do with something very strange, actually. It's called transparency. I'm going to give you an example. In a lot of countries, employees pay social contributions, right? But who actually pays it? Who sees the bill? It's the employer. And actually, the employee does not really feel or see how much social contribution he or she pays. Do you follow me? But in a lot of countries, self-employed people, they pay their social contributions themselves. They feel it, they see it, and they start making constructions with expenses, with societies, with tax avoidance and tax evasions, because it's very transparent what they pay. And hence, what do we see in a lot of countries, self-employed, when they take up their pension, they say, I paid so much social contributions over the years, that's my money. While a civil servant and an employee who often have paid far more in social contributions, but is far more intransparent, will not have that reflex. So I think that you go to a sauna with a lot of self-employed in Lithuania.
I would like only to add that people on the one hand treat those pension capital as a private property, and on the other, they would like to receive lifelong security. So when we let them take the lump sums, then we have to trust they will use it for pension purpose, or this is not the case very, very often. So the pension itself will not fulfill its role, its task. So it will not secure them and provide them with money till the end of the life. However, we let them to be free, and we let them to do with the money what they want. So they are pleased right now, but they will be probably disappointed at the end of the life. It is about the culture. It is about the attitude also, what people expect from the pension system. So it's the case of Poland. So they refuse state on one hand, on the other they expect state will protect them. So it's really a conflict.
Okay, tai jau konfliktai. Kas turit klausimų, bičiuliai, prašau, Algirdas Tysas.
Ačiū. Aš turiu du klausimus, kadangi mane jau pristatė kaip būsimą ministrą. Tai, ponia Joanai, jūs pasakėt, kad anuitetas yra labai brangus dalykas net Lenkijai. Mūsų rinka yra 10 kartų mažesnė. Na, tai jeigu kalbėti. Bet mūsų anuitetus, taip sakant, pensiniai fondai, antros pakopos, taip sakant, įpiršo valstybė, mokesčių mokėtojai. Tai vienas klausimas, ar tai yra, taip sakant, logiška ir suprantama. Ir pono Ivui klausimas būtų, mes turim jau 15 metų profesinių pensijų arba darbinių fondų įstatymų. Deja, nė vieno fondo per 15 metų nesusikūrė. Ir labiausiai to nenori patys darbdaviai, nes jie socialiniam draudimui išvis dabar nedalyvauja. Viską sumoka darbuotojas, nors visą laiką sakė, kad čia darbdavio pinigai ir jie čia tokį daro gerą darbą. Tai mano klausimas būtų, turbūt kitų šalių patirtį gerai žinote, išmanote, ar darbdavius, taip sakant, paprašyti dalyvauti pensiniuose fonduose galima taip gražia forma, ar visgi reikia priimti įstatymą, kuris, ką padarė Lenkija, įpareigoja juos dalyvauti ir mokėti tam tikrą mokestį. Ačiū.
Okay, I will try to answer the first question. We did the same. So we made open pension funds voluntary and we introduced so-called security slide. So 10 years before retirement, the whole pension capital, funded pension capital, is transferred into pay-as-you-go part of the pension system on the individual sub-account. And then it is paid out as a total pension. At the very beginning, we assumed there will be a special annuities company established in Poland. However, we didn't agree how they should operate, and we didn't agree about fees. At the very beginning, they assumed the pension capital, which I put into the annuity company, will be reduced by 7%. And it was a huge discussion if it is enough, it is not. And at the end, they resigned from this solution. And as Steve already mentioned in his presentation, there is a longevity risk, which should be somehow calculated by the provider. And it is really a huge problem because we can make some assumptions, but we don't know exactly how it will come out in 20, 30, 50 years. And discount rate is also a big question mark, although the nature on the nature market, the insurance companies or annuity companies do the business, so it is possible.
Thank you. If I may add something on the first question. Annuity markets are quite tough markets because you need to be able to buy sufficient long-term guarantees products that are inflation stable. And one of the reasons why the Netherlands are having so many difficulties in upholding their annuity markets by pension funds is that it's very difficult to find stable products, actually. They're all products, but they're not on the long term. If you want to buy anything that's longer than 10 to 15 years, that's inflation free, it's quite a tough market. It exists, but tough market, and it's a very expensive market. A very well written paper, actually, on your question was written by Mark van Eeswijk. I can send it to you if you like. It's really on the expenses of annuity markets. It's a complicated market. On your second question on how to make employers involved. There are several elements actually underlying your question. But we see that a lot of countries are actually trying to experiment, not by voluntary, it's not working, not by mandatory, it's not working, or half working, and they're trying something in between. And that in between is often called auto-enrollment, whereby you're obliged to enroll, but you can opt out after a while. Some countries have successes, others don't have successes. But when we start with something like auto-enrollment, then there are two elements that we need to take into account. The first one is actually the labeling of the money. If you say that an employee pays a contribution, who is actually bearing the cost? Who pays it? Who's the one who pays it? It's a label. The cost is actually of the employer, because he has a firm, he makes the money, and it's the employee, whereby we say we label a part of the salary as being a contribution. But from an economic point of view, this is just the labeling of money. And of course, an employer could not work without employees. There would not be a human capital industry. So it's obviously that he earns the money. But whether you label it as an employee contribution, an employer contribution, or a tax subsidy, it makes a huge difference in your pension construction. Because whether you label it in one way or another, the cost for the employer can remain the same, but the consequences in the system can alter very strongly. So I would suggest that if you would go for auto-enrollment types of things, you need to consider labeling very correctly what type of money you want to give, what earmarked system. Because if you say it's a social contribution or it's a pension contribution and it's earmarked for that, then the price can be the same, but by earmarking it, you give it a real influence on what it is. That's the first element. The second element is, it's probably the same in Lithuania. We're utterly missing a part of occupational pensions that's going on in the labor market. We see a digitalized economy with a lot of platform workers, which are often not into the system as we should take them on. So if you go for auto-enrollment and if you go for mandatory or voluntary and you start earmarking, don't forget that there's a part of the population that are probably outside of the system anyhow. So you need to take care of those bolt drivers if they're not in this. I don't know, are they in the system, the bolt drivers? So, but you must make sure that if you do something with self-employed and platform workers, that the earmark and the auto-enrollment system opens up for them as well. So don't make a mistake like Italy, that they make earmark taxation, that they put the auto-enrollment, but just for a very limited group. It will not work. And it even didn't work in Italy as such because of these two mistakes.
Konferencijos prezidentas Ganas.
Tai labai įdomus pranešimai. Klausydamasis būsimo ministro, aš jutau lyg tai viltyje toj, kurie aurimas čia, tai vyrai. temperatūra užlygė, bet reikia kažkaip tai sumažinti. Tai pirmas dalykas dėl profesinių pensijų. Tai iš tikrųjų, kaip Stevensas sakė, kurios šalys jos tiesiog nukopijavo nuo kitų šalių profesinių pensijų įstatymą, kaip Lietuva, būtent tas pavyzdys, sakyčiau, blogas pavyzdys, nes Lietuva nukopijavo nuo Danijos. Iš esmės vienas prie vieno, buvo viskas nukopijuota, bet ekosistema, kuri yra būtent, kurios buvo pastatyta profesinių pensijų sistema Danijoje, Lietuvoje, kultūrinė prasme, apie ką kalbėjo Stevensas, ne visiškai yra kitokia. Ir netitinka nei darbdavių, nei darbuotojų atstovaujamų organizacijų galimybių dalyvauti šitoj sistemoje. Dėl, sakykime, nei patirties, nei finansinių pajėgumų. Taigi klausimas yra toks, bet jis labai susietas, ką Joanna kalbėjo, kas Stevensas kalbėjo. Dabar grįžtu, ką kalbėjo Joanna. Joanna kalbėjo apie tai, kad jūsų sistemoje žmonės gali pasiskolinti būtent iš pensijų fondo, neprisimenu, kokia arba kažkokį. Dabar, žiūrėkite, mes darbdaviai nedalyvaujame. Sakykite, kokia prasmė dalyvauti kur? Jeigu nėra pačios sistemos, nėra sukurta bazės, mechanizmo nėra, mes tada dalyvaujame antroje arba trečioje pakopoje. Nu, antra, jinai, kaip yra gera, trečia, aš sakyčiau, gudruoti. Tu gali įslinkti pinigus įnešęs ten ir aš nesuprantu, kaip jie apskritai dabar veikia. Bet Stevensai, jūs kalbėjote apie tai, kaip kartu veikia. Tai yra revoliucinis, evoliucinis. Kaip jūs galvojate, ar Lietuvą reikėtų kurti visiškai naują? Aš neįsivaizduoju, ar įmanoma sukurti, remiantis dabartiniu šituo įstatymu, ar visgi pritaikyti, sakykime, trečią pakopą, kur aš matau tikrai būtų labai galima pritaikyti profesinių pensijų, bet kas galėtų motyvuoti darbdavius dalyvauti joje? Ar tai tiesiog tu esi socialiai atsakingas, tu rūpinies darbuotojas, neveikia sistemos? Tai reiškia, turi būti kažkokia motyva. Tada jeigu mes sukaupėme profesinių pensijų fondą, sakykime, pinigų sumą, ką kalbėjo Joanna, darbuotojai gali pasiskolinti. Ar įmonė galėtų pasiskolinti, jeigu tai, sakykime, būtų labai sunkus momentas? Aš kalbu apie tai, kas valdys tos pinigus. Ar tai bus atiduoti kažkokiam operatoriui. Ir pinigai, jie kažkur iškeliauja ir mes nežinom. Aš suprantu, sistema veiktų tada, jeigu darbdaviai galėtų, sakykime, su darbuotojų organizacijų dalyvauti kažkokioj tai formai ir valdyti tos pinigus. Tada sistema veikia. Kitų atveju nieko.
Ačiū. Thank you for your remarks and general comments. Just to make sure that we're on the same page here, I never ever anywhere in the world preach for revolutions. I always preach for evolutions, just to make sure. So underlying your question is actually, how do you get employers involved? How do you manage them? And you actually, at the end of your third remark, you actually gave a partial answer. You should give employers some form of responsibility and accountability in organizing and setting up the schemes. So that's my slide with Bismarck, that you should make compromises and that you should allow employers to be part of the game. If you don't do that, it will not work because they don't feel accountable, they don't feel responsible. And it's like when you have children and you're married and the marriage goes on, you both feel responsible for the child. But when there is a divorce and the child is not with you at that moment, your accountability, your responsibility alters. And it's the same here. So I really believe the whole rules will explain this later, that when you have paritarian systems, they more or less work. And that's immediately the link to your first comment. The Danish system, the Volkswagen, is in that perspective a very good system because the social partners are really strongly involved in the mechanism itself. And
what is good about the Danish system is actually that to start in another way. It has to do with their fiscal and tax structure. I don't know a lot about the Lithuanian tax structure, to be honest, but we know that there is a link actually between the progressivity in income taxes and progressivity in society taxes and how you distribute wealth. The more flat rated tax systems you have, both in income tax and society tax, the far harder it is to install redistributive effects. Why? Because of course, if you have flat rate taxes, you always have high winners and high losers. So progressivity in tax, going from, I'm not saying how high or how low, I don't know the Lithuanian system, but we know that the more flat rate tax the systems are, the more difficult it is to get employers involved. It is obvious. Why? Because the tax deduction they get out of the system when they pay pension contributions is treated on the same low or high flat rate system. So what I would suggest, first of all, is have a look. When they would ask me to have a look at that type of thing, I would first look into the Lithuanian tax on societies and how the tax deduction goes, and then do the earmarking. And then I would look at the Lithuanian income tax and see how the contributions and the pensions are taxed at the end. And by them pinpointing what granularity you have both in the income tax and in the society tax, then I think we could talk on talking about contributions. So I know my answer is rather technical, but I think the answer lies actually in the tax system. I don't know whether it's clear what I mean, but your answer is really in the tax system, I believe.
So I will provide you with some more details concerning the Polish pension system and occupational pension system, what we need. So as you probably remember, the rule of employees in case of PPE was much more important than it was done in case of PPK. So the employee representation really is an important actor in setting and running of the program. So it should be a company agreement signed, and they have to allow to suspend pay contributions by the employer and so on and so on. And this rule was limited in case of PPK, as the employee representation is as an advisory rule, so their opinion can be taken into consideration or not. So the employer can decide on his own about the provider. But the employer itself, in case of PPK, don't have any influence on the provider, can't manage money itself. It was the case concerning PPE, as there was a possibility to establish an employee pension fund. And we have two funds so far in Poland. So the employers were not really interested in to do it and to run it actively. When you ask about revolution or evolution, we agree. I agree with Yves, and we all agree it shouldn't be a revolution. However, it was somehow done in Poland. What we did, those employers who already had PPE were not obliged to establish PPK unless the total contribution paid by the employer was at the level at least 3.5%, and the participation rate was not lower than 25%. And it is checked every 6 months. So if those requirements will not be fulfilled in the future, the employer is obliged again to establish PPK.
If I may, because I actually forgot to answer to the second remark. You asked something about whether you could allow employers to have hardship clauses, and I forgot to answer to that. Sorry for that. I don't know any country in the world that has hardship clauses in occupational pensions for employers. I don't know that. But what I do know actually is that there are quite a lot of countries actually that have installed a mechanism. It's often in defined benefit or in collective defined contribution systems. It can be organized in defined contribution, that's more complicated, but where you have what we call contribution holidays. It actually means that the return on investment is so high that the employer does not have to pay anything for the coming year because the accumulated return of investment is so high for 1 year that he can be free of a holiday, free of contribution payments. And for example, in the Netherlands and also in Belgium, we have some pension funds that have been in contribution holidays for, I'm now looking at all, for 30 years. So where employers haven't paid a single euro, it's not a single, for 30 years. Why not? Because the contribution holiday allows them to just use the return on investment to pay the upcoming contribution. So that's not a hardship clause, but it means that you can have an effect. But this effect also depends on how you invest. And there I agree that if you want the asset management to be part of the system, you need to have the employers on board. If not, it will not run. Another thing is make sure that there are not too much government bonds investments. Because if we have government bond investments, it's actually organizing a pay-as-you-go system through your insurance companies or through your pension funds, because it's actually just money turning around again. That was a hiccup. That last one. That was the last one.
Yeah. So we have, moderator is responsible for the police.
Oh, yeah.
We will start that time and we'll finish. And I think our audience has only one question now. One copy. But we have two respectable professors from Vilnius University who raised their hands and want to ask. Because I have a challenge. When 4 professors will start to talk, it's unmanageable in terms of time. So 2 minutes, okay? For questions, brief, and minute to answers, okay? Let's regime. Professor Lazutka.
Ačiū labai už pranešimus. Pirmo pranešimą, pirmiausia, iš pirmo klausimas buvo, kad lamsam priklauso, kaip traktuojama pensijų sistema, ar daugiau bylų giminė, ar nuosavybės. Ir jeigu nuosavybės, tai tuomet labiau priimtina išmokėti lamsam. Bet atrodo, ir buvo ten pavyzdžių, kad pereinama į tos nuosavybės daugiau sistemas pažįstama. Ir atrodo, kad tai yra labai tokia bendresnė tendencija, kad pereinama yra nuo defined atvirkščiai nuo defined benefit to defined contribution, bet tai reiškia kartu, kad darbdavys tuomet neprisima rizikos ir kartu senatvėje bus labiau diferencijuotos pajamos, pensijos ir kita vertus daugiau ko gero skurdo. Ir ar tai nėra tiesiog bendra tendencija, kad tos sistemos šiais laikais nebe taip tinka, kada yra dinamiška ekonomika, darbdavys nebegali prisimti rizikos, kaip kad buvo prieš 100 metų ar kada tai, kai tos pensijų sistemos buvo kūriamos. Žodžiu, ar tai nėra bendra tendencija ir tiesiog rodo, kad sistemos tos yra atgyvenusios.
Let's catch one more question from Alice.
Well, thank you for the presentation. As I'm only part-time professor, so I will try to be quick and also switch to Lithuanian. Ačiū už prezentacijas ir Yves, jums klausimas apie tai, kaip jūs sakėt, kad tam, kad kaupiamosios sistemos būtų tvarios ir pakankamos, iš esmės visos 3 šalys, tai yra žmogus, darbdavys ir valstybė, turėtų dėti po 1 eurą, arba dalyvauti to lygiai. Gal jūs galėtumėte pasidalinti vakarų praktiką, kaip tai yra iš esmės įgyvendinta, nes tikriausiai valstybė dalyvauja tam tikras mokestinės paskatas, žmogus deda iš savo kišenės, nes darbdavys deda. Kiek yra realybėje proporcija išlaikyta ir į kurią pusę galbūt krypsta? Ir Joanai klausimas irgi trumpas, mes visą laiką kalbam, ką daryti, o gal iš Lenkijos patirties jūs galėtumėte patarti kokius 2-3 dalykus, ko mums nedaryti. Ačiū.
Tadas also head of private funds.
Okay, very short. Okay, so one, yes, there's a worldwide shift from DB to DC, everyone knows. Underlying question actually is, what is the cost, what is the price you want to pay for your pension? If you want to have a sure pension, a guaranteed pension in the DC, then you will have a very low pension. Guaranteed pension in occupational pensions is a low pension. So the question is, who is going to bear the risk? Is it the employer, the employee, or so it's a question of risk management actually. And there, if you have annuities or lump sum, you're in an entirely different world. 1 minute. A lot of countries that actually started with occupational pensions, they had a proportionate element of financing. So 1-1-1. Now, of course, the state does not have this one as a real thing, but as a subsidy. And actually, when we see how this is subsidized, often the countries actually take it into the societal tax. So it's in the taxes. And that's the reason why I answered to the start. I should look into how it's taxed and how the tax system works within a given country if you want to know how to pull the strings. And on the €1 for an employee or €1 of an employer, it's just labeling. It has nothing to do with bearing the cost. It's about labeling an economic price. Yeah. Thank you.
Two things. Be careful about trust. It's the first thing I can say based on the Polish experience. So don't do any rapid changes and don't over communicate to public, but also the second thing is involve all parties and actors and make a political consensus about what to do, how to do, when to do.
Thank you, wonderful professors, for your very brief answers. Ačiū iki